The little shop seemed to have taken the musty, worm-eaten quality of furniture and relics it offered for sale. There was an all-pervasive odor of mildew and decaying wood. Dust motes whirled in a shaft of sunlight as the street door opened, with the hushed tinkle of a bell above the sedate gold letters, Jonathan Sproul, Antiques. The three young people who entered, arm in arm, looked as out of place in such a shop as three children at a board meeting. The girl, a vivacious brunette with a large diamond solitaire on her left hand, linked the two men together, one a tall, easygoing Norse blonde, the other small, wiry, and dark, with sensitive features that resembled those of the girl. They stood for a moment, laughing and chattering together, but in lowered tones, somewhat subdued by the atmosphere of the old shop. No, not 3 rings, Bob. Rings are so trite, the girl was protesting. What we want is something unusual, right, Alan? Something distinctive to link us 3 together always, like the 3 Musketeers, and remind us of our undying... She broke off with a stifled gasp as a stooped, wrinkled gnome of a man, a hunchback, scuttled out from the shadowy recesses at the rear of the place. There was something spider-like about his appearance, until he smiled. Large, luminous brown eyes beamed upon each of them in turn. I overheard, he murmured in a mellow, friendly voice that matched his eyes. You are looking for some little memento. His eyes drifted keenly to the girl. Soon as your wedding day, yes? He hazarded. And you and your brother and your fiancé wish to buy some antique curio in triplicate as a bond of love and remembrance. The trio glanced at one another, jaws dropping. Why, yes, the girl laughed. You must be psychic. Observation, merely observation and deduction, the old proprietor chuckled pleasantly. I have very little trade here, worse luck, and much time to meditate. Now what did you have in mind? 3 identical snuff boxes, perhaps, 17th century. Or what about lockets, Renaissance Italian, with your pictures in each? I have some that fold open in 3 sections. 2 of them could be worn as watch fobs, of course. He smiled at the 2 utterly unlike but congenial young men. They grinned back at him, wondering curiously among the cluttered displays of crow's nest tables, hammered brass fire dogs, old spinning wheels, and 100 other reminders of generations past. Idly, they wandered over to a showcase of antique silverware, ornate gold and silver sugar shells, pickle forks with tiny demons on the handle, little salt spoons, and graceful dagger-shaped butter knives. The girl strolled away by herself, poking about with quiet fascination. Presently, her eyes fell on a small, worn, black velvet case, pushed half out of sight on a shelf. She leaned to open it and called out eagerly, "Look! Oh, Alan Bob, look! I found some monkey spoons." She beckoned to her brother and fiancé, then smiled across the shop at the old proprietor, whose sudden look of agitation she failed to notice. "These are monkey spoons, aren't they, Mr. Sproul? I've never seen any with a drinking monkey perched on the knob. It's always something stylized, a fawn or a skull. These must be very old." The 2 men moved to her side, fondly amused at her excitement. The blonde one, Bob, looked at the dark one, Alan, and spread his hands humorously. "What on earth," he drawled, "are monkey spoons? Alan, if we're going to open that antique shop of ours, with my backing and Marcia's and your experience, you'll just have to brief me on these." The brother and sister started explaining, both at once, interrupting each other. They gave up, laughing. Then suddenly Mr. Sproul stepped forward, edging unobtrusively between the 3 young people and the black velvet box. Monkey spoons, he explained diffidently, were presented by the old Dutch patroons to honored guests and relatives, as late as the 17th century. They were mementos of some occasion, a funeral most often. As you can see from these very fine specimens, skillfully he steered the trio away to another showcase, shutting the black velvet box behind him with a furtive gesture. These, he pointed out one set of 5, are typical. Note the wide, shallow, fluted bowl of the spoon, very thin silver, bearing a hammered-out picture symbolic of funerals, a man on horseback delivering the invitations, with a churchyard in the background. These bear a likeness of St. Michael, weigher of souls on Judgment Day. This one has a picture of a mourner weeping over a cinerary urn. "Brr, cheerful little trinkets, aren't they?" Bob laughed, resting one hand on Alan's shoulder and sliding his other arm about his fiancée's waist. "You mean to say they passed out these things at funerals, like flowers at a party?" "Not exactly," Mr. Sproul smiled. They were hung around the rim of the punch bowl at the dude feast, or dead feast, something like the Irishman's wake. A small silver lozenge, the seal, was always welded at the center of the handle, engraved with the name of the deceased and the dates of his birth and death. The handles are quite slender, you see. They curl backwards like the end of a violin to form the knop, on which is mounted a silver fawn, or a skull, or a monkey? The girl asked eagerly. Why monkey spoons, Mr. Sproul? She drifted over to the black box again and picked up one spoon. I've always wondered why they're called that. That, the old dealer shrugged his humped shoulders, is an enigma among antique experts. One theory is that the monkey was simply a symbolic invitation to come and be gay at the dead feast. Eat, drink, and be merry, you know, for tomorrow. Zwieging der monkey, or sucking the monkey, was an old Dutch expression meaning to get drunk. Ugh. Marcia's delicate nose wrinkled in distaste. I certainly wouldn't want everybody getting soused at my funeral. They'll just have to sit around and cry soberly, or they'll get no monkey spoons from me. Remember that now, Bob. She laughed and planted a kiss on her fiancé's cheek. Hush. Her brother, the more sensitive of the two men, shuddered visibly. Marcia, don't be so morbid. People shouldn't joke about... Who's morbid? The girl laughed more gaily, winking at Bob. Oh, Alan, you're a sissy. Do come and look at these darling monkey spoons over here. Those with the drinking monkeys are very rare, aren't they, Mr. Sproul? There are only 3 of these. Her face lighted up, and she whirled about at a sudden idea. Why don't we choose these for our keepsakes? I could have mine made into a scarf pin, Bob. Yours and Alan's could be watch fobs, or you could have them welded on silver cigarette cases. Some old Dutchman's funeral spoons. Wouldn't that just be too gruesome and clever? And, she added eagerly, we can call our antique shop the 3 Spoons, and people will drop in by the droves just to ask us why. Bob, darling, please buy them. Her fiancé grinned at her fondly, winked at her discomforted brother, and reached for his checkbook with a light shrug. All right, my precious, all right. Anything your foolish little heart desires. But funeral spoons. He roared with amusement. What a gift from the groom to the bride. Mr. Sproul, how much are you asking for... He broke off, caught by the expression on the face of the hunchbacked antique dealer. Mr. Sproul looked frightened. There was no mistaking that quiver about his mouth, or the agitation in his kindly old eyes. Wouldn't you prefer something less expensive? He blurted. Those particular spoons are almost a collector's item. Besides, he added in an oddly loud tone, they're not mine to sell, really. They're not mine. He emphasized the word strangely and glanced toward the dark rear of the shop, as though he were speaking for the benefit of some skulking eavesdropper whom they could not see. The former owner, he lowered his voice again in apology, was a Mrs. Haversham, an elderly widow. Her heirs have not yet been located. She died without a will about a month ago, shortly after buying the set of 4 monkey spoons at an auction. She kept 1 spoon and left 3 of them with me to sell for her at a profit. Merely as her agent, he emphasized sharply, with another odd glance toward a particularly dark corner. She kept a 4th spoon, not wanting to part with her entire collection. She was asphyxiated in her garage, he added with apparent irrelevance. Carbon monoxide gas from her car. An accidental death, of course, he said quickly, again with that nervous glance into the shadows. The girl Marcia, her fiancé Bob, and her brother Alan looked at one another significantly. The old hunchback was certainly peculiar to say the least. A borderline mental case, Bob's raised eyebrows suggested. With a glance at his fiancée's disappointed expression, he became brisk and businesslike. Well, you have the legal right to sell the spoons, though, and collect your commission, he pointed out shrewdly. How much? $500, Mr. Sproul murmured, then added with a manner of pleading, That's exorbitant, of course, and I can find you something much more attractive for the price. Exorbitant? You can say that again, for 3 little spoons? The blond young man whistled good-humoredly, but uncapped his fountain pen. That's $500 apiece, Mr. Sproul said hurriedly, for each spoon. Now I'm sure you wouldn't care to pay so much for a whim. Let me just show you. Bob set his jaw stubbornly, giving the old dealer an oblique look. Mr. Sproul, don't you want to make this sale? Look, if you're trying to run up the price, he snapped, just because my fiancé has taken such a fancy to... He broke off, grinned abruptly, and spread his hands in rueful defeat. All right, you old pirate. $1,500 it is. He smiled indulgently at the girl beside him, who was shaking her head violently. If it's something you really want, darling, you shall have it. Old Mr. Sproul sighed deeply, with a tone of resignation rather than of satisfaction. "The price," he said heavily, "is $500 for the set, if you insist on buying it. But I must tell you this, although I am sure you young people will laugh at me, or perhaps be even more intrigued by these devilish spoons. You see, Mr. Sproul gulped. "They're supposed to be cursed." The two men did laugh, but the girl's face lit up. She clapped her hands, as pleased as a child with its first jack-o'-lantern. "Oh, a curse! How marvelous! Why didn't you tell us before? Now I simply must have them." The old hunchback nodded and shrugged. "As I predicted," he murmured. Then doggedly, "The spoons are mementos of the funeral of an old Dutch patroon, Schuyler Van Grooten, you'll see his name on the seals, who owned and tenant-farmed about half of the Connecticut Valley in the 1600s. Mrs. Haversham had an old Dutch diary written by one of his ancestors. I was able to translate only a few pages when I called at her home, but it seems there were 13 spoons originally. Rather a significant unlucky number, as the patroon was secretly murdered by friends and relatives who would inherit his estate. One by one, the story goes, he caused 6 guilty ones to die, exactly as he himself had died. The remaining owners of the monkey spoons became frightened finally and gave theirs away, thereby escaping his vengeance. But anybody who owns the spoons inherits the curse, is that it?" Marcia cried delightedly. "Alan, isn't it exciting? Oh, Bob, do give Mr. Sproul a check before somebody comes in and buys our haunted spoons right out from under our noses." The antique dealer looked at her and sighed. He saw the girl's brother bite his lips, frowning. But the blond young man grinned at his fiancée and wrote out a check for the 3 monkey spoons. Opening the black velvet box, he presented one of the spoons to Marcia with an exaggerated bow. The second he gave to Alan, holding it over his wrist like a proffered rapier. The third spoon he thrust carelessly into the pocket of his tweed coat. Then, laughing at his horseplay, Marcia offered an arm to each of the 2 young men, and they marched out together, whistling in harmony, into the sunlit street. Behind them, old Mr. Sproul, although he was not a very devout Catholic, crossed himself. He ran a finger around under his collar and inhaled noisily, aware all at once of the extreme stuffiness of his little shop. It was unusually close in here today, he thought, almost stifling. He scurried to a window and flung it open, gulping in lungfuls of cool autumn air, as if, for some reason, he found it terribly hard to breathe. It was almost closing time, about a week later, when the bell over his door tinkled again, and 2 of the attractive young threesome walked into his shop. Mr. Sproul scuttled forward to meet them, beaming in recognition, but his smile faded at the sight of the grim expression on the blond man's face, and the stunned, swollen-eyed look of the pretty girl. She had been crying, the older dealer saw, and Bob, her fiancé, was tight-lipped and cold with anger. "Yes?" Mr. Sproul murmured hesitantly. "You were not satisfied with your purchase?" An odd look of hope leaped into his eyes. "You wish to return the spoons, perhaps? Of course I shall be glad to refund your—" For an answer, the blond young man thrust one of the delicate little monkey spoons under his nose, pointing to the tiny silver seal welded at the center of the handle. "Is this your idea of a joke?" he snapped. The antique dealer blinked, and putting on an old-fashioned pair of square-lens spectacles, peered at the spoon. The blood ebbed slowly from his face. "I don't understand," he stammered. "When I sold them to you, the inscriptions read Schuyler Van Grooten, born August 3rd, 1586, died June 8, 1631. But now it reads Alan Fentress, born September 14th, 1924, died November 3rd, 1949. Why," he broke off, "that's yesterday." A sob burst from the girl, and she buried her face against her fiancé's shoulder, weeping wildly. Bob glared at Mr. Sproul. "Yes," he said harshly, "and Alan was drowned yesterday, November 3rd, 1949. The death date engraved on that damned— How the devil did you get hold of Alan's spoon?" He towered over the old cripple threateningly. "You sadistic old— You took that seal off, didn't you? And welded the new one on just to stir up some freak publicity and boom trade for your crummy little shop. But Alan," he ground out through clenched teeth, "why did you have to pick on Alan? Because you knew he was moody and susceptible to suggestion? Because you knew he'd brood over your little hoax, not telling us? His painting wasn't going well lately, so you thought it would be a cinch to drive him to suicide. Out there in the lake yesterday, he just stopped swimming and went under. When I got his clothes from the locker room, I found this damn spoon you changed, like a death sentence." Mr. Sproul gasped, looking first at the dead youth's angry friend, then at his grieving sister. "Oh no," he protested. "My dear young people, you surely don't accuse me of—" "You're upset. Who wouldn't be?" "It's the curse," he said quietly. "Remember, I did my best to warn you." "To plant your story, you mean," the young man snarled. Glaring at him furiously, he led the girl toward the door. "Come on, darling. I might have known we'd get no satisfaction out of this cold-blooded old ghoul. But let me tell you," he threw back furiously at the antique dealer, "when I locate the engraver who changed that inscription, or find out how you learned Alan's birth date, I'll come back here and kill you." The door slammed with an agitated jingle of the little bell. Mr. Sproul stood for a moment, wringing his hands miserably. He had liked those 3 light-hearted young people on sight, and would not for the world have wished harm to befall any of them. But there were forces a crippled old man could not combat. Forces older than any item in his musty little shop. Older than logic. Older than time. "Oh dear heaven," the hunchback moaned. "Why didn't I tell them to give those other 2 spoons away? Melt them down, bury them, anything. If that diary had only told how Van Grooten died, perhaps I could have warned them to avoid—" But there were only hints. The writer never did come out and say. But that young man is intelligent. Perhaps he could come to some conclusion that I've missed. He turned and ran for the telephone directory, leafing through it hastily to find the names Fentress or Milam, the signature on the young man's check. For an hour he clung to the phone, calling every Fentress and Milam in the book, but there was no Robert Milam. Mr. Sproul tried the hotels, then the funeral homes to trace the dead brother, Alan. Finally he hung up, defeated, concluding that they were all from out of town. He sat staring at the telephone then, wringing his wrinkled old hands in the helpless anguish of one who can only wait for disaster. But the period of waiting was not long. 3 days later, just at noon, the doorbell tinkled again. Mr. Sproul looked up from a 6-branched candelabra he was polishing to see a disheveled figure swaying a few feet from him. It was Bob Milam, his face drawn and covered with a stubble of beard, his eyes bloodshot and puffy from drinking. In his hand he held an ugly little automatic. Mr. Sproul caught his breath and stood very still. Then, despite his own fear, he burst out, "Oh, my poor young friend! The second spoon! Your fiancé?" The blond man's mouth twisted with pain and bitterness. For reply, he flung another one of the monkey spoons at the old dealer's feet. Mr. Sproul stooped to pick it up. He paled and nodded. The tiny oval seal on the handle was engraved to read, "Marcia Fentress, born April 17, 1927, died November 6, 1949. At the old man's nod, Bob's eyes narrowed. He said not a word, but the ominous click of the safety catch on his gun was eloquent enough. Yet there was more pity than terror in Mr. Sproul's face. "Oh," his murmur of shocked sympathy had a genuine ring. "How did she—" "My fiancé," the young man grated bitterly, "was terribly grief-stricken at her brother's death. You figured on that too, didn't you? You insane, twisted—" His voice broke on a sob of impotent rage. "Alan and Marcia were inseparable. We 3 were, in fact. Marcia couldn't sleep, so last night she took a big dose of sleeping pills." He gulped, then plunged on miserably. "While she was drugged, a very large beauty pillow on her bed fell over her face somehow. It wasn't the sleeping pills. She smothered to death. The coroner called it an accident," he lashed out, "but I call it murder. You murdered Alan too. I can't prove it, but I surely as hell can—" With a sob, he leveled the gun at the old antique dealer's heart, his mouth working with hate and grief. At the sight of his tortured young face, Mr. Sproul dabbed at his eyes, oblivious to his own danger. "My poor unfortunate young friend," he murmured pityingly. "You can't believe I would cause such tragedy for a few paltry dollars. I did not change those seals, but I cannot hope to persuade anyone as matter-of-fact as yourself to believe in the supernatural. The diary recounts that when each guest at Van Grooten's dead feast died, their spoons changed too. Mrs. Haversham's seal altered also. The lawyer found it later among her effects, but assumed it to be the grim jest of some house servant." Bob Milam snorted derisively, but the murderous anger in his eyes ebbed slowly, and the gun in his hand wavered. "You're insane," he said heavily. "Maybe you don't even realize you changed those seals. Maybe your twisted mind really believes all that silly guff about some old Dutchman who—" His shoulders slumped all at once. He swayed, passing one hand over his bleary eyes. The gun in his other hand clattered to the floor. Suddenly he snatched the monkey spoon and flung it down the furnace grating. "Insane," he mumbled. I can't shoot a crazy crippled old man in cold blood." "But why did you do it?" he groaned, staring at the hunchback. "Why, Mr. Sproul, why? My best friend and then my fiancé. I'd gladly have signed over my whole bank account to you if it was money you—" "Oh, please," the antique dealer cried out in despair. "You must believe that I had no part in— I tried to phone you, to warn you. Tried to figure out the manner of death so you could avoid— But they all died so differently. Mrs. Haversham asphyxiated. Your friend drowned. And your lovely fiancé—" The old man's eyes widened suddenly. "Ah, now I understand. It's true. It all ties together. Listen to me." Bob Milam had turned unsteadily toward the door, but Mr. Sproul sidled after him like a small persistent crab and seized him by the arm. "No, wait, you must listen," he gasped. "The diary mentioned that Schuyler Van Grooten was subject to sleeping fits, a cataleptic. His intimate friends and relatives must have known that, but they—" "Wait," he begged. "Your monkey spoon, where is it? You must give it away at once," the old dealer insisted excitedly. "To some impersonal agency, the scrap metal drive. Yes, that's it. Get it out of your possession, or you too will—" So much hate, such hunger for revenge hovers about them. Like a piece of metal that's been magnetized, they can actually draw disaster to anyone who— But at that moment, the blond young man jerked his arm loose and plunged out into the street, wanting only to get away from this crazy old man who had caused him so much grief in the space of a few short days. Mr. Sproul pattered after him, calling excitedly for him to wait. But by the time he reached the curb, Bob Milam had whistled down a passing cab and was climbing into it. The old hunchback hurried to the curb and strained to catch the address. But the young man was only telling the driver wearily, "Drive around. Just drive anywhere. I don't care." The antique dealer's arms dropped to his sides limply in defeat. He watched the taxi speed out of sight, then turned slowly and walked slowly, thoughtfully, back into his shop. The evening paper, left under his door as usual, carried the story. A taxi was ambling along 187th Street, where wreckers were busy raising an old warehouse. Somehow the dynamite charge went off sooner than was intended, and a crumbling wall of bricks and mortar fell on the cab as it passed. The cabbie managed to dig his way out, but the single passenger, an intoxicated young man identified as one Robert Milam of New Jersey, could not be pulled out of the wreckage for almost an hour. He was dead when frantic workmen did finally reach him, not crushed, but trapped without air in the rear seat of the taxicab. And in his pocket, the police found a peculiar-looking spoon, inscribed with his name, the date of his birth, and the very date of his death. Mr. Sproul finished reading, then took off his square-lensed glasses and polished them with a hand that trembled. There was nothing, he mused philosophically, really nothing at all that he could have done to save those three nice young people, who had all three died the same way, fighting for breath, smothered to death by one agency or another, just exactly as Mrs. Haversham had died in her exhaust-filled garage. And just as, centuries ago, an old Dutch patroon, one Schuyler Van Grooten, had died, clawing and screaming and gasping for breath in his coffin, awakened from one of his cataleptic trances to find that his greedy heirs had deliberately buried him alive. It has been 10 years since my uncle, Philip Westerly, disappeared. Many theories have been advanced as to why and how he vanished so strangely and so completely. Many have wondered why a man should vanish and leave nothing behind him but a smashed mirror. And none of these theories or wild imaginings are half so fantastic as the story I gathered from the diary which some whim prompted him to keep. But first, a word about Philip Westerly. He was a wealthy man, and also a cruel, selfish man. His wealth was attributed to the same cruelty and selfishness. He also had many whims. One of them was keeping a diary. Another was his love for mirrors. He was handsome in a cruel sort of way, and almost effeminate in his liking to stand before them and admire himself. This eccentricity was borne out by the fact that covering one whole side of his room was a mirror of gigantic size, the same mirror that is linked with his disappearance. But read the excerpts from the diary of Philip Westerly. August 3rd, afternoon. Billings asked for an extension on that note today, but I saw no reason why I should grant him any such thing. When I told him this, he began cursing me in a frightful manner. He said I was cruel, and that someday I would be called to account for the way I treated people. I laughed outright at this, but at the same time I felt a vague sense of uneasiness, which even yet I have not dispelled. Night. A remarkable thing has happened. I had gone to my room to dress for dinner, and I was standing before the mirror tying my tie. I had begun the usual procedure that one follows, when I noticed that no such action was recorded in the mirror. True, there was my reflection in the glass, but it followed none of the movements that I made. It was immobile. I extended my hand to touch the reflection and encountered nothing but the polished surface of the mirror. Then I noticed a truly remarkable thing. The reflection in the mirror wore no tie. I stepped back, aghast. Was this an illusion? Had my mind and vision been affected by some malady that I was not aware of? Impossible. Then I regarded the reflection with a more careful scrutiny. There were a number of differences between it and myself. For one thing, it wore a stubby growth of beard on its face. I was positive that I had visited the barber that very day and passed my hand across my chin to verify this. It encountered nothing but smooth skin. The lips of the man in the mirror drooped in a display of gnarled yellow fangs, while my own bared nothing but 2 rows of gleaming, well-cared-for teeth. I was filled simultaneously with a feeling of disgust and fear, and looked for further discrepancies. I found them. The feet and hands were abnormally large, and the clothing of the thing was old, baggy, and covered with filth. I dared not stay longer. I tied the tie as best I could, and descended hurriedly to dinner. August 4th, morning. I awoke feeling jaded and tired. My friend in the mirror is still with me. Ordinarily, the reflection of myself in bed is caught in the mirror, but not so this morning. Instead, I saw that the dweller within had, like myself, been having a night's rest. I hope he slept better than I did, for my own night was a series of fitful, restless tossings. "Good morning," I said, rising. When I moved, he moved. As I advanced toward the mirror, he drew closer to me. I stopped and surveyed him. He resembled me only remotely, I hope. I smiled, and he responded with a wolfish twist of his mouth. I extended my hand as if I wanted to shake hands with him, but he drew back as if from fire. I can't understand the terror which he holds for me. I try not to show my fear in front of him, but I feel that, animal-like, he senses it. I refer to the reflection as he, him, or it, for I cannot bring myself to admit that the thing in the mirror is my reflection. But I scarcely dare write what I do believe it to be. I have always been skeptical about such things as soul, but when I look into the mirror, God help me. Night. I am spending much time in my room now. I've spent most of the day here. This thing is beginning to hold a morbid fascination for me. I can't stay away for any length of time. I wish I could. My wife is beginning to worry about me. She says I look pale. She tells me I need a rest, a long rest. If I could only confide in her, in anyone, but I can't. I must fight and wait this out alone. August 5th. There has been little or no change in our relationship. He still remains aloof. Today, my wife came to my room to see how I was feeling. She stood in such a position that looking into the mirror was unavoidable. She stood before the mirror, arranging her hair. She noticed nothing out of the ordinary, but he was still there. Damn him. He was still there, and this time he snarled in triumph at me. One other remarkable thing. My wife hadn't seen the thing there in the mirror, but neither had I seen her reflection. It was the same with Peter, my valet, and Anna, the maid. Anna would have dusted the mirror had I not stopped her. I must take no chances. A close scrutiny might reveal him to them, and they must not know. They must not know. August 6th. 3 days. 3 days of hell. That's what it's been since I discovered that damned thing. How he tortures me. He has begun to mock me. When he thinks he has given an extraordinarily clever impersonation, he shakes with laughter. I can't hear him laugh, but I see him, and that's worse. I can't stand it much longer. August 7th. We never know how much we can stand until we go through some ordeal, such as I am now undergoing. But I feel that my nerve is near the breaking point. I have locked the door of my room. Anna leaves a tray outside my door. Sometimes I eat the food she brings, but more often I don't. My wife begs me to let her in, but I tell her to go away. I'm afraid to tell her. I'm afraid to tell anyone. I know what they do with people who have hallucinations. No, I can't tell. Neither can I leave. God knows why, but I can't. August 8th. It was the day before yesterday that I mentioned his mocking me. Today, I tremble at the thought. He is beginning to resemble me. This morning I looked in the mirror and discovered that he had discarded his rags and was now dressed in one of my suits. I ran to the wardrobe and discovered his clothes hanging where mine had been. I turned and faced him. He laughed and pointed toward my hands and feet. They were bloated beyond recognition. I dare not guess how far this change has gone. I can write no more today. August 9th. The change is complete. He looks more like me than I do myself. He has grown more cruel with the change. He taunts me with my ugliness. Finally, I could stand it no longer. I fled from the room. At last I found the thing I was looking for, a mirror. When I came face to face with what I now am, I nearly collapsed. Yes, he has taken my form. God pity me, I've taken his. I slunk back to the room in horror, back to his laughter and the hell that is now my existence. God knows what tomorrow will bring. August 10th. 7 days since that devil has been in the mirror. I prayed to God that it may be the last. It will. I know it will. He in the mirror senses it too. I see the look of apprehension in his eyes. Damn him. It's my turn to snarl in triumph now. For when I lay down this pen, for the last time perhaps, I shall leap through the mirror. And he exists only in the mirror. God help me. I am laying down my pen. The taxi drove off, leaving Foster on the Hoddesdon lawn, surrounded by suitcases. Foster was thinking it more than merely odd that Barclay, for whose coaching he had come prepared to spend a month, had not met him as planned. He tried the screen door. It was hooked inside. "Hello in there," he hailed hopefully. There was no response. The Hoddesdon farm lay drenched in a torpid lethargy, for which it was obvious more than the July heat must be responsible. Within the house, no one stirred. On the surrounding fields, no one was abroad. Even the usual sounds of the farm animals were hushed. Foster was unpleasantly affected. Surely the entire household had not gone to meet his train and somehow missed it. He carried his traps to the stoop, crossed the yard to the barnyard, and called out again. He knew of old where Barclay's studio was, so he set off down the path toward the grateful shade of the woods. The gray stone walls of the old building soon glinted through the tree trunks and heavy foliage. A strong conviction possessed Foster that Barclay was not within. In fact, he found the studio door padlocked. He noted that the west window was rudely boarded up. He walked around the studio to the north. Here, the trees had been cut down, and the studio wall was entirely of glass. He peered in with deepening curiosity, but apart from the usual litter of easels, painting paraphernalia, and accessories, canvases in close-set rows against the walls, his attention was almost immediately drawn to a painting propped against the south wall, where the full light from the opposite windows poured in revealingly. "How odd," Foster muttered, puzzled. "That doesn't look like Barclay's work, and he would never have let a student perpetrate such a monstrosity of line and crude color." He pressed his face to the glass, cupping it against the outside light. "That old man," Foster said aloud, amazed, "may be crudely done, but he's also absolutely horrible. His hands, they're dead hands. Bloodless, waxen. Something about the way he's sitting there, drooping as if he hadn't the strength to sit erect, and was being held by something without that you can't see. I don't like the thing, it's ugly. There's something wrong with it." He said this last with conviction, and as he exclaimed, became aware of another gaze fixed upon himself. He snapped upright and wheeled quickly. Waiting patiently for him to finish his examination of the studio's interior, stood a man in patched, stained blue overalls. "Well?" snapped Foster sharply, a bit taken aback. "Mr. Barclay's at the house, sir. You're Mr. Foster? I'm Mulcahy, Hoddesdon's hired man." Foster nodded. "All right, I'm coming. How did Mr. Barclay come to miss my train?" "We was all down at the police station, sir." Mulcahy fell in behind him. "Police station?" echoed Foster. "What's been going on here?" "I found Mr. Oakey dead in the studio this morning, sir." "What?" Foster whirled and confronted the Irishman. "There's something wrong in there, sir. I saw blood on the old devil's beard." The man's voice quavered. "Snap out of it, Mulcahy. Are you referring to that picture?" I am that, sir. Blood on the old man's beard. Ridiculous. I saw none. Mulcahy insisted stubbornly. Blood it was, sir, and the poor young man's was all drained out of him. Foster stiffened to deep attention. Ha! This sounds intriguing. Blood on the old man's beard. And dripping from his dead fingers, sir, and not one drop left in the corpse. Blood all over the damned old devil's whiskers and his dead fingers, sir. Mary Mother. Mulcahy crossed himself with pious haste. Who did that painting? Foster demanded, turning again toward the house. A man by the name of Silva. He's actually a cabinet maker, but he got to thinking he could paint, so he made that beauty back there. Devil fly away with him. He sure can paint, muttered Foster cryptically. He's mixing something with his paint that only devils from the pit can give him, the Irishman declared darkly. He hesitated, then rushed on. Sir, the night before the poor lad was murdered, there was a fine canvas of Mr. Barclay's cut into ribbons, and Mr. Oakey's prize picture the same. What might that mean, along with the poor lad's being killed the next night? And Silva only getting honorable mention last week where he was looking for first prize. Looks as if Silva had a motive, declared Foster as they walked into the barnyard. Life was stirring normally about the farm now, as if a ban of enchanted silence had been lifted. Foster could see Barclay's bulky body leaning over the suitcases on the front stoop. He hailed his friend, then asked Mulcahy hastily, What did the police say? Any of us might have done it, sir, but the studio was locked from the inside, and there's no motive. They can't figure out where the poor lad's blood went, sir. The back of the simple words pushed a dark significance of terrible things. Looks as if there's more here than appears on the surface. Right you are, sir. From now on, Tom Mulcahy wears a blessed medal next his hide, day and night. Foster met Barclay's welcoming hand with a heartening grip. Sorry to have missed you, Foster, but this ghastly tragedy has dislocated all plans. I was fond of the boy, groaned Barclay, his face working. He had a gift, had Harry. I was looking forward to what he would do with color in the not-far future. And now, his voice broke. Where's my room, Barclay? Foster gathered up his bags and followed the other painter up the front stairs. Both men lighted cigarettes in silence. Barclay stared abstractedly from the window, while Foster unpacked rapidly, puffing clouds of smoke about himself as he tossed shirts, underwear, ties into the open bureau of drawers. I want to know how Silva's painting got into your studio, he said at last, with an air of relief as he finished his work. So you're taking that attitude? Barclay asked, his eyes heavy. Foster did not attempt to evade the implied issue. Anybody but a crass, materialistic jackass would, he responded quietly. I didn't know you went in for that sort of thing. I've no time for anything but painting. Just making a living takes most of my time these days, Foster. The younger man's eyes snapped. A very little suffices for me. I'm too fascinated with studying the truths underlying the illusions of material existence. Not that I've gotten very far, but what I know, I know. Then perhaps you can say what's unnatural about poor Harry's death. I know there's something wrong about it. Something wrong, echoed the younger man thoughtfully. Yes, there's something wrong and uncanny about this lad's death. As to it being unnatural, there are many strange and little-known laws operating along lines so new to us. He broke off there, his expression clearing as if an illuminating idea had suddenly clarified the situation for him. I believe the poor chap's death is due to an extremely interesting example of the transference of an evil will to power. Barclay wheeled from the window, saying abruptly, I didn't tell the police what I felt lay behind this tragedy. I have no hankering to live in an insane asylum. Now I have a faint hope that you may be able to appreciate the strangeness of my experience. Listen. Manuel Silva settled here a few years ago and has been doing well as a cabinet maker. Recently, he learned that I got from $300 up for a canvas. He thought this an easy way to get rich, but I refused to teach him. You know I never take any but advanced students of decided promise. My refusal roused Silva's furious resentment. I've instituted an annual art exhibit in town. Silva entered 3 canvases to force my hand. They were rather terrible. One was a blacksmith, dark, sullen, sinister. He was hammering viciously at what appeared to be a battered crucifix. Another was a farmer slaughtering a wretched hog that somehow looked like a naked man. The butcher's face wore a too realistic grin of sadistic enjoyment as he wielded his bloody knife. The third was the painting you've just seen in my studio. Harry's entry took first prize. This was inevitable. I felt inclined to encourage a couple of young local artists, so gave them honorable mention. Not to slight Silva's pride, I included him. The night before the canvases were removed, Harry and I were in the gallery, and he pointed out that someone had deliberately cut the honorable mention ribbon on Silva's canvas so that it hung in dangling strips. Odd that, eh? Your opening vistas, replied Foster, lighting another cigarette from the one he had been smoking. You are absorbingly interesting. I criticized Silva's painting, observing that Harry was right when he said it gave him the jitters, but that in just that degree it possessed a touch of wild genius. Harry pronounced it ghastly, to paint a hunched-up old man as dead as a doornail, his hands frightful, decomposing, yet sitting up there, ugh. Silva's colors were crude, his drawing distorted. Just how, it would be difficult to say, but wrong, you understand. Wrong. I said I dared not encourage Silva because of a very strange quality in his work. That's something wrong. And then we both nearly jumped out of our skins, for in the dusk behind us someone broke into an ugly chuckle, and we turned to see a dark figure slouching out. It was Silva, and I realized that he'd heard me pronounce him an evil genius. Harry made light of my compunctions, but I was disturbed. We confronted the old man in the painting once more. As twilight gained the room, a murky dusk seemed creeping into the very canvas. Its shadows deepened. The old man merged into his dark background, all but his pallid face, his grayish beard, the waxen fingers dropping over his angular knees. It was wrong, entirely wrong. And then all at once Harry twitched my sleeve and exclaimed, "Let's get out of here," and we turned and plunged into the street, stricken by some subtle panic so obsessing that it was not until we were back at the Hoddesdon farm that we realized how foolish and unreasonable had been our flight. Foster lighted another cigarette. We went sketching next day, Barclay went on, and Hoddesdon brought our canvases back to the studio. That night he told me that Silva had sent me one of his for a gift, so Harry and I went down to see which one. We lighted candles, and really, we got a nasty shock. The flickering, inadequate candlelight made that old man appear more than ever an entity with a horrid existence, independent of his painted presentment. Harry said, "My God," in a kind of comic dismay. I knew instinctively that Silva was up to no good. He bore me malice. His very gift seemed to convey dire menace. In the pale candlelight, the old man's beard appeared to rustle stiffly, as if his lips were parting under its bushy shelter. Of course, I couldn't see anything, but I felt that I was seeing a pale, dead tongue flick moisture over dry, dead lips. That must have been an odd sensation, said Foster, as he expelled a thick cloud of smoke. You make it very clear. Yes? Well, there's more of it, Foster. Oki and I went over our canvases to check on their return in good condition. We were satisfied. Just remember this point, will you? We padlocked the studio door and went off to bed. When we went in next morning, the padlock was undisturbed and all the windows locked on the inside. But one of my best canvases had been slit into ribbons, and Harry's, which had taken first prize, was completely demolished, even the frame. That last act of vandalism made me feel bad. I'd been sure the boy could cash in on his work, and he needed the money. He took it like a Spartan, but he told me he was going to sleep in the studio that night, for he felt sure that Silva had done the damage. I agreed, although I couldn't figure out how Silva could have gotten inside. So last night I left the boy there. He said he was going to hang something over the old man's god-awful face. I offered to stay with him, but he wouldn't have it. This morning... Barclay broke down, turning back to the window with a suspicious gulp. Mulcahy told me, Foster hastened to say, lighting another cigarette. It was ghastly, Foster. Mulcahy was howling blood at every jump he took. Blood, he yelled, on the old man's beard. How about the coroner? Harry'd been dead for hours. Finger marks on his throat. Every drop of blood drained from his body, Barclay said with slow emphasis. Mulcahy had seen him through the north windows. I had to break the west window to get in. The coroner said at first that he'd had a fit, but finally decided he'd been killed by a person unknown. About the blood? Queried Foster. Mulcahy was right about it. Foster, I saw it too. It's not there now, Foster declared. Barclay nodded. That's another strange thing. When I rushed over, I found poor Harry sprawling on the floor, his body all twisted in a grotesque, gruesome position, and so terribly white. As I threw myself on the floor beside him, something struck upon my inner ear. It was a sound. But such a sound. Even as I heard it, I knew I was hearing what could not be apprehended physically. I sprang to my feet and confronted Silva's hideous canvas. God, it was horrible. He shuddered at the bare recollection. The painted old man sat there motionless, but it was a sinister restraint, Foster. I stared, stricken by a horror that affected me with nausea. For I saw then that someone had smeared that ancient's deathly pallor with crimson that crawled down the painted gray beard. The dead hands that hung over the angular knees were dripping, every pallid fingertip, with blood. Blood, Foster. How do you know it was blood? Foster demanded sharply. I touched it, whispered the old man distastefully. And then? Foster prompted, not ungently. A ghastly thing came to pass. I did not see it, I felt rather than saw. I became aware, with that inner sense, of the movement of one of the old man's painted arms. It lifted with the jerking unevenness of an automaton and passed across the stained gray beard. I say it moved. I felt it move, yet at the same time I was aware that it was only painted, hence incapable of movement. It was a something else behind it that actually moved. I find it almost impossible to clarify my intuitions, Barclay deprecated despairingly, other than to say that while the painted figure did not stir, I was yet inwardly aware that it lifted one arm and wiped away the crimson from its beard. Then it reached out on either side to drag off that horrible drip from its waxen fingertips against the painted grass that reddened under them. God, it was the more horrible because, although the figure did not show movement to my straining eyes, yet I saw the crimson lifeblood of poor Harry disappearing from the canvas as those movements which I felt rather than saw took place. Of course, this explanation is inadequate, he finished. Foster pushed the consumed tip of his cigarette to the fresh one he was holding between his thin lips. A cloud of blue smoke enveloped him, out of which his voice pronounced decidedly, "Not inadequate, my dear fellow. On the contrary, it is very enlightening. So clear that I believe we may yet punish the murderer of that poor lad." Barclay's dreamy eyes burned with sudden fire. "I'd give a year of my life to accomplish that," he exclaimed fiercely. "I hardly think so much will be required, but you may have to sacrifice one or two of your canvases. We'd better get the rest of Oki's work over here, and Silva must learn that you are taking steps to protect Harry's work and your own. He must be informed that tomorrow night you yourself will sleep in the studio. That will bring him," Foster predicted darkly. "You agree that it's Silva?" cried Barclay in relief. "I've no doubt of it, but not in propria persona. He's projecting his astral body through that hideous old man, and he's already made a grave error." "What do you mean?" "He's permitted himself to savor human blood. Hence he cannot be permitted to continue. He's dangerous now. He will be yet more so, unless checked. I propose to do this in the only permanent way possible." "We have no proof of his presence in the studio, Foster. Who would believe the intangible evidence of my experience?" "No one, ordinarily," Foster agreed, adding quickly, "but I believe. And there is another person who will not only believe, but will furnish me with the means of putting a stop to Silva's murderous proclivities, without disturbing the authorities unduly," he finished dryly. "Wouldn't it be wise to return that picture to Silva, or cut it to bits and burn it?" suggested Barclay uneasily. "Later," said Foster queerly. "You see, Silva has somehow learned how to transfer his will for evil to that creature of his own making. It is through that same creation that we must reach him and stop his criminal career before it is too late." Barclay sighed. "You speak as if you knew what you were talking about, Foster. I can't just understand you, but I feel that you are somehow right. What do you wish done?" "Get Mulcahy or Hoddesdon to clear out all Oki's canvases. Leave only a couple of your own that you don't particularly care about, so as not to stir Silva's suspicions overly. He'll imagine you're exhibiting. Then have Hoddesdon step in and tell Silva what happened to the canvases in the studio, and ask him to have his moved out of harm's way. That will appear a kindly impulse on your part, and he will reply that he'll send for his canvas in a couple of days. He'll figure on polishing you off by then," finished Foster callously. "Agreeable thought, that," sighed the older painter. "Now, you're going to lend me your roadster. I'll be back tomorrow afternoon at the latest. Be sure Silva is given to understand that tomorrow night you'll be sleeping in the studio. Under no circumstances, however, venture in there tonight," Foster warned gravely. "Tonight, Silva, or whatever wakens in the studio under the stimulus of his evil purpose, may have free play. But tomorrow night I shall be there, not you." "I won't permit your getting into a nasty situation, Foster. This isn't your affair, after all. Harry was my protege. It's up to me." "Are you prepared to give effective battle to a painted demon, Barclay?" Foster's laugh was incredulous. "Can you, through that painted thing, silence forever the intangible distant malefactor?" "You can do such things?" said Barclay's hushed murmur. I shall know how to before I return tomorrow afternoon. But how? I'm going to someone who knows. I shall demand the secret. She will yield it, I'm certain. I'm going to see Gwen Caradorne." "Where have I heard that name?" puzzled Barclay. "Possibly in connection with her published brochures. Her Reality of the Abstract is fairly well known. It's discussed everywhere." "Quite likely," sighed Barclay. "I seem to remember it vaguely." "Now," pursued Foster briskly, "how about your car?" It was dusk when Foster returned on the following day. The seriousness and abstraction that wove a cloak about him struck Barclay's curious inquiries into silence. A certain high air about the younger artist forbade imperiously any break upon that lofty mood. Foster's first query was, had Silva been duly informed of the occupation of the studio that night? "He knows. He told Hoddesdon that he would call for his unappreciated masterpiece in a couple of days." The words were significantly emphasized. "I rather fancied he'd say that. He knows you'll be there tonight. Hoddesdon told him if there were any further trouble I'd sleep there from tonight on to protect his painting." "Excellent." Foster rubbed his hands together and blew a cloud of thick smoke from the cigarette in one corner of his mouth. "And was there any?" "Yes. Last night the 2 canvases I'd left were demolished." "Good. He'll be expecting you to sleep there tonight. Let's have supper. Then I'll run into town and fetch Miss Caradorne. She insists upon coming out. The time was too brief to prepare me to handle the situation single-handed." "That's extraordinarily kind of her, Foster. But if she is to be at the studio tonight, why not I?" Barclay insisted. "She would have handled it alone, only that she—" Foster broke off suddenly, looking apologetic. "Sorry I can't be more explicit, but she bans discussion of herself unless she decides to come out into the open, which she rarely does. Well, wait until you meet her, if she permits it," Foster broke off in a kind of embarrassment. "You'll understand then. But believe me, she is worthy the highest respect and admiration a human being could expect." Foster did not have to drive to town. Between dusk and dark, a shining dark blue car with a special delivery body slipped into the driveway. From the limousine-like front, 2 uniformed men alighted and walked to the rear of the car. There were wide doors there, which they proceeded to open. They withdrew, with the utmost care, a strange anachronism, a blue and black and gold decorated sedan chair, small and delicate. They placed themselves between the shafts and started toward the farmhouse. Foster exclaimed and sprang down the steps to meet that odd equipage. He bent over what was obviously an extended hand, white in the dusk. Barclay, staring, saw the young artist touch his lips to those extended fingers. A child's high, shrilly sweet voice gave an order, and the chair-bearers carried the sedan chair toward the barnyard. Foster followed, calling back as he went, "See you tomorrow morning, Barclay." With that, he disappeared after the chair, into the soft darkness beyond the barnyard. Barclay felt that he could not sleep. He was intensely irritated that Gwen Caradorne should have sent a child to take her place, in what he felt must be a post of danger. He went down to the shining automobile and walked around it with curiosity. The rear doors had been closed, and nothing marked it as out of the ordinary, save, perhaps, the expensive type of shock absorbers for a delivery body, and of course what looked very like a periscope set in the top, as much out of place as was a modern child in a sedan chair. He sat at his window, fell asleep there in his chair, and did not waken until Mrs. Hoddesdon tapped at his door, calling that Mr. Foster and the little girl had returned. She volunteered that the little girl was a perfect little French doll. Barclay took the stairs 3 at a stride. In the hall, Foster sat on a hassock, which brought his face slightly below the level of the small oval countenance of the child, who sat sedately on the hall chair. Barclay noted with an artist's appreciation the bloom on her dazzling cheeks, the straight nose, the richly scarlet mobile lips. He approved the curling black lashes, finely penciled arching eyebrows, sleek black bobbed hair. Her creamy silk dress, rather longer than worn by most children of her age, apparently about 6, was smocked in a knowing fashion with bright colors. Her feet were inappropriately encased in high-heeled French slippers. All this the artist and Barclay captured at a glance, just as he took in the beauty of the slender, tiny hands, of the taper fingers, and the eloquence of every gesture. A strange and unusual child, this. His leaping footsteps brought upon him a lifting of fringed eyelids, and what he felt shrinkingly was a glance of indifference. He stopped short at the foot of the staircase, abashed at this disdainful glance. He knew all at once why this child's frock was longer than customary, why her tiny feet wore adult-styled footgear, why sophistication animated those taper fingers. The cobalt blue eyes that regarded him from the child's elfin face were the eyes of a grown woman. They were the informed eyes of one who has passed through the fires of varied experiences, the eyes of one who has gazed unafraid upon unveiled mysteries. The child was not a child, but was an exquisite midget, a creature set apart from the entire world by her miniature proportions. Foster sprang up, caught the other man's hand, and drew him down to the hassock, himself sinking upon the floor so that both men's faces were below the level of the midget's. "Barclay," Foster said in a tone of repressed excitement, "Miss Caradorne permits me to present you." "Honored, Miss Caradorne," mumbled Barclay, still confused under the keen gaze of those faintly derisive blue eyes. He understood it after a minute. She was touched with amusement at his discomfiture. An elfish smile twitched at one corner of her scarlet lips, and she actually turned away those two shrewd eyes, as if to spare Barclay's feelings, a kindly gesture which did not serve to tranquilize him, for there was just a touch of condescension in her half-smile. "Mr. Foster has been showing me these canvases from your studio," she said, slowly, in a shrilly sweet voice. "I would very much like that snow scene. It is charming. If you will tell me the price." Barclay's embarrassment vanished. Here he could be sure of himself. "I would feel honored if you would accept it as a proof of my gratitude for your having come here," he began, but his eyes questioned Foster. "You are anxious to learn the outcome of last night's plans," said Miss Caradorne's high voice lightly. Suspended in the bosom of her frock by a slender platinum chain was a platinum whistle, which she put to her lips and sounded. At once the bearers of the sedan chair came up the steps and into the hall, holding the chair close to their mistress. Like some bright bird, so airy and graceful was her lithe movement, she seemed to fly from her chair into the sedan's shelter. She waved one tiny hand. The bearers took their light burden outside, slid it into place in the rear of the waiting automobile. They mounted into the front, and the car slipped noiselessly away down the road, bespeaking the many-cylindered motor by its very silence and power. Barclay stared after it, amazed. "So that strange little thing is your wonderful Gwen Caradorne. Why didn't you warn me?" Foster lighted a cigarette hastily and began surrounding himself with smoke. "Why didn't I? Because she won't be talked about. She's proud and sensitive. She considers her miniature body the ultimate of human perfection and won't permit its comparison with what she considers our gross bodies. And she's abnormally proud of her brain. She has reason to be. I think it is the most highly developed I've ever known. As an occultist, she's the seventh daughter of a seventh daughter." Foster broke off brusquely. "You were anxious to know about last night. She has forbidden me to divulge details, but I may tell you briefly that Silva will never again repeat his evil act." "He was there, then, last night," gasped Barclay incredulously. "Not in propria persona, but his familiar was already locked in with us when I bolted the door behind Gwen and myself." "What do you mean?" Foster sighed resignedly. "Let's go down to the studio. It's easier to understand when you've seen things with your own eyes." The telephone rang. Mrs. Hoddesdon ran out of the kitchen and answered it. An expression of horror settled on her placid face. "Manuel Silva's been found dead, with a knife wound in his throat," she called, and gave closer attention to the telephone. Foster beckoned Barclay silently, and the two hurried across the barnyard and into the woods. With the key Barclay had loaned him, Foster unlocked the padlock. He pushed the studio door open. Words seemed superfluous. Spread on the floor lay a painted canvas figure, pinned down by a knife through its throat. The edges of the canvas were sharply defined, as if just cut out of the painting, leaning against the south wall, with a neatly trimmed vacancy in its center. Barclay stared, closed his eyes convulsively, then stared again. "I couldn't have done it alone," Foster kept repeating in a kind of feverish excitement. "She furnished the power. She'd have done it herself, but she's too... he corrected himself hastily, he was too tall." Barclay stared, motionless. He was absorbing the details of a bizarre thing which confirmed him in his hasty resolution to burn Silva's painting without delay. The empty space in the painting distinctly outlined a drooping, seated figure. The painted canvas shape lying on the floor, pinned down by the knife through its pallid painted throat, could have filled that vacancy twice over. It was a full-length, standing figure.